Behind the stage, it was dark and quiet and smelled of moss. This was the entrance to the deep forest where children often played, but were warned not to stray too far. The ruins of a goat shed stood there. It had fallen into disuse since the building of the cow barn. Out of the darkness came the braying of a goat, and a white shadow slipped between the trees. Maggie Mender's remaining herd still roamed about untethered here, simply because they preferred this place to anywhere else. "Does anybody have a light?" asked Bearclaw. "I do," came a voice. It was Marta, the scullery maid and keeper of the cows. She held up a small corn lamp with a glass mantle. "Take me with you." They set out into the dark, the four musicians with Chestnut and Marta. The trail skirted the slope of the little green mountain, commonly known as the Hunter's Horn. Attaining some elevation, they began to hear the distant, agitated voices from the meadow through the muffling of the trees. The sound was not unlike the call of a flock of northbound geese, or the crackling of a fresh fire, or the patter of spring rain. Over the path ahead, owls flew deeper into the forest, away from the approaching light. Suddenly, there was more light, glowing from behind them. Johnny and Bearclaw turned at the same moment. Several more lamps were moving among the trees, following the convolutions of the trail, and there were shadowy human forms and the sound of labored breathing. "Who goes?" called out Bearclaw. "Friends," came a voice. Another softer voice added, "And lovers." As the figures gathered in a circle of illumination, Johnny scanned the faces. He recognized some of them. There were Chamomile and Celandine, two of the Hoop Girls. Celandine in a blue hooded cape, and Chamomile with a lace shawl across her shoulders. Tom Cleaver stood there, still wearing his blood-stained apron. Turner, the woodworker, was leaning against a tree. And Johnny recognized the plain-dressed man and woman who he had encountered on the road entering the town. "We will have no more to do with those abstainers, such a dour lot." Behind these people there were others, maybe 30, maybe 40, some children, some elderly, some carried lamps, others huddled in the darkness. We want music," said Tom Cleaver. "We don't like what's happening back there." Bearclaw stood still for a while, his eyes studying the gathered crowd. "Follow us then," he said at last. "I know a place." The trail grew steeper after that, the trees larger, closer together, and bearded with shaggy moss. Strands of silvery moonlight slanted through the branches. Overhead they heard the skittering of bats. The Hoop Girls began to sing a wordless duet based on one of the fiddle tunes. Johnny couldn't place which. They came to a place where a tree had fallen across the path. Jocko stayed behind to help each person over it. Johnny held back so he could listen to the string of curious words and phrases Jocko delivered to the comrades as they scaled the log. Keep your blue eye in your pocket and your brown eye in your hand. A rabbit is always behind you. Give me your 7 fingers. It gets bigger at the bottom. Just below the summit of Hunter's Horn, the forest opened to accommodate a large, sloped clearing, oval-shaped, indented as if some giant childbearing woman had rested her enormous belly there. The full moon hung directly overhead in a dome of stars, its golden light pouring like cream over the clearing and over the layers of treetops, rolling down to the plain of king corn and the bald knob of grassy hill which stood as her gate. There seemed to be a collective sigh of relief as the people spilled out of the confines of the forest into the freedom of the clearing. They fanned out into it with laughter and soft conversation. Children began to twirl. The hoop girls formed an invisible hoop with their clasped hands and began spinning it sunwise, gathering up the children with each turn. Short phrases of melody rose from voices and rippled through the crowd. Gradually, people began to find their places and settle down. The musicians, accompanied to performing on a stage, gravitated to a flat slab of rock near the tree wall at the top of the clearing, where they could survey the entire scene and the moonlit vista that lay beyond. Aunt set Chestnut down. The little girl sat on the edge of the rock, clutching her quilt, staring out at the settling crowd. Some people gathered close, others clustered at distances all the way to the lower line of trees. Some brought blankets, cloaks, bed sheets to spread on the ground. Others remained standing, a quiet cradled in. First the singing, then the conversations grew silent until there was nothing left but a rustling expectation. We should be tuned, whispered Bearclaw. Yes, we should, affirmed Ant. Bearclaw cocked his ear to the strings and twisted the pegs until he was able to produce a ringing major chord. Ant and Johnny quickly followed. Murmurs of approval echoed from the audience and a smattering of gentle applause. Jocko started playing. The notes were free of the invasive edge of amplification. They were more of a suggestion, a rhythm, a relaxed amble, like a dog on a walk. A few heads began to nod. Bearclaw rapped his knuckles on the fretboard, looking for the downbeat. He glanced up. You call it, Johnny Arcane? Woodpecker's Dream, called Johnny Arcane. And they were off. The moment the music started, Johnny knew this time would be different. The harmonic sweetness of the very first chord snapped his heart in two. Images gushed into his mind, and all of them bore the name of Lucy. He remembered how she had once told him it wasn't always her name. Bow Wow gave it to her. It means morning light. How many seasons had he carried her in his body? How many nights had the sweet softness of her skin been pressed against his in the illumination of memory? And through the dark lands he had pushed on to save her, and he had saved her, but only by taking the life of another, and others perhaps considering Mars, the boy, the pony. Bearclaw called the next tune, Up the Misty Mountain. It was easy to follow. Johnny's fingers knew the way. He looked out on the crowd spread across the clearing. They all looked like mummers, quietly performing the passion play of life. Everyone was moving, some almost imperceptibly, gently swaying just the arms, the shoulders, the fingers, thrumming rhythms on knees, heads bobbing like nestling robins. Others, especially women, especially in the distance, spun and swooned, weaving filaments of moonlight between their fingers, eyes closed, drawing the music inward into a shared but private place. The cabbage moth, called out Ant. The key shifted. How did it turn out this way? How did Bow Wow know it was not their destiny to be together? The ache struck him so hard he pounded it into the strings of his mandolin. But the music just continued. Every memory stung him with sadness, even the good ones. The first warm welcome of the open road and the deep dark isolation that followed. The first cornfest at King Corn when he climbed the silo and brought down the honey. The seasons wandering as a messenger, the drawing of the map of the known world, the return to King Corn for the winter of the wolves and the cows. A conversation played itself in its entirety. He was talking to Jocko on the eve of the discovery of the principles of electricity. I can feel Lucy, he said. I can feel where she is, which direction, how far away, like how you can feel where your arm is, even when you can't see it. Jocko's response was immediate. You must have left something inside of her then. The boatman's daughter, called Jocko as he pulled back the broom handle and steered the rhythm into a new direction. It was then that Johnny realized that all of them, Jocko, Bearclaw, Ant, all of them had come with their hearts ripped from their bodies and splayed on the strings. Happy to meet always meant sorry to part. And now the borders of the known world were crumbling. The cornmeal had blown away, and the forces of chaos and cruelty were moving in. The people before him knew it too, he could tell. They had fled the chaos of Cornfest and followed the four musicians, seeking the peace and beauty they felt slipping from their lives. He turned from his strings and focused on the faces lit by moonlight, some young and smooth, some old and weathered, some standing, some seated, some lying flat on their backs, staring at the starry sky. Some moved with grace, some with awkward clumsiness. But they were all moving now, even the ones who appeared to be still. There was a rippling motion circling sunwise, shifting, elusive, hypnotic. At the back of the crowd, a man stood. Johnny recognized him at once. It was the stranger who had escaped with his wife from abstinence. Such a dour lot. He was still wearing his plain brown farmer's clothes, but there seemed to be a glow coming from him. Perhaps it was just a trick of the moon. The moment he found his feet, his arms began to rise, like a heron opening its wings. With the ascent of his arms, his head lifted from his shoulders, his mouth an O of wonder. His eyes turned upward, and his hands went out ahead and upward, reaching. Then, for a moment, his body began to rise from the ground, slowly, like a plume of smoke. A few people nearby turned and gasped. A sound like a coat of doves passed outward through the crowd. A look of astonishment dawned on the man's face, and he let out a tiny cry. Suddenly, he went dark. All the glow of his body faded, and he collapsed on the ground. Everyone in the band saw it happen. Distracted but driven by the music, they kept playing until a commotion rose around the fallen man. "No! No!" a woman cried. "What happened? What happened to him? Oh, Percival, no! Please, Percival, don't do this to me. What's wrong with him? He's dead. He's dead. Percival." The music fell apart. Bearclaw sat down his guitar and jumped from the stone. The others followed. So deep had been the peace that a calm prevailed, even in spite of the urgency of the moment. People stepped aside to let the musicians pass. The voices conveyed curiosity and concern, but very little fear. They gathered around the fallen man. Johnny, Jocko, Bearclaw, and Ant, with Chestnut in arm. Someone lit a corn lamp. The woman was sitting on the ground, weeping, the man's head in her lap. Bearclaw knelt, tilted the man's head, listened for breathing, and felt for a pulse. Finally, he looked up into the woman's face. "He's gone." The woman began to wail, and soon a wall of wailing and shrieking moved outward from the center of the circle. But still, there was a sense of calm that would not be broken emanating from the man. People drew closer. Some laid their hands on the woman's shoulders, her head, her arms, speaking in soothing, comforting tones. Some reached out to touch the man himself. He was floating. Did you see? He rose up into the air. Look at his face, his smile. When the news reached the boundary of the crowd, an ululation of women's voices rang out and moved back toward the center. "Percival," sobbed the woman. "Why?" "We should take him to Maggie's," said Bearclaw. "She's a safe distance from the meadow. I'll need some help." 8 men gathered around. Someone brought a heavy wool blanket. They made a bed out of it and hoisted the man into the air. All the while his face retained the sweet smile of a sleeping infant. The woman clung to her husband's arms as the bearers began to move. People started singing. It was an old melody that Johnny recognized at once. The soft light of dawn. Aunt recognized it as well. She set Chestnut down on her wobbly feet and joined in, on the fiddle. Bearclaw couldn't play his guitar, though. He was one of the men bearing the body. Johnny stayed behind, his heart pensive, both troubled and calm. The singers and the twirlers and the body bearers lumbered forward in a procession toward the opening where the trail led into the dark forest and back to town. The singing continued, accompanied by the fiddle. With weeping and chanting and tender embraces, they disappeared, lamp by lamp, into the screen of trees, the lights flickering like fireflies, the voices fading, vanishing dreams. Johnny found himself alone in the moonlit clearing. His face was flushed and his heart throbbing. Behind him, someone spoke. "Johnny." He turned. It was Jocko. "Jocko," he said, "come with me. Let's take a walk."